She went to the courthouse for a simple copy of her marriage certificate. The clerk opened a file, looked at her, and said a line that lodged in her chest like a cold stone. "Ma'am, according to our records, you're already divorced." The words landed before she could shape them into sense. Papers were cold under her fingers. The fluorescent lights hummed. Outside, the city moved on as if nothing had shifted beneath her feet. For years, Laya Carrington had thought the slow distance in her marriage was ordinary drift. Fatigue from night shifts, the way two people learned to live side by side without speaking their hardest things. They'd shared a small condo, weekends of takeout and reruns, and the long, ordinary accountability of marriage bills. Marcus had been a presence that became background, practical, at times distant, a man who handled the mortgage, the car insurance, the little bureaucracies that made life run. Now someone had redrawn the scene without her consent. The records showed a sealed file, a stamped date, a signature that was not hers. It took seconds for shock to harden into the particular kind of humiliation that comes from discovery, an intimate betrayal rendered bureaucratic, official. The clerk's voice was neutral. The world around her remained neutral. She stood in the hallway with paperwork, and the sudden private knowledge that her name had been rewritten in ink she never authorized. That evening she went back to their condo. The front door was unlocked. There were 2 mugs in the sink, a jacket tossed over a chair, nothing dramatic, nothing to confirm the registrar's blunt certainty. But then she found a keycard tucked beneath a stack of mail. She rode the elevator 3 floors down and watched the vehicle pull away. Across the street, a building she had never been to bore Marcus's name on the tenant list. Her name was not there. She learned then that his life had split. There was an address she did not share, a life with another woman she did not know. Weeks before, the signs had been small and easy to explain away. A phone left face down at the kitchen table that Marcus refused to pick up with her in the room. A ledger he kept on the computer, password protected, that he always shut when she walked by. Money moved in ways she couldn't track, late fees paid by transfers she didn't authorize, checks endorsed for names she didn't recognize. Once, when she asked about a signature on a mortgage document, he laughed it off, said she worried too much. She had believed him. She wanted to believe him. Trust, in the end, is the accumulation of small safeties. It unraveled the same way, stitch by stitch. When the truth arrived, court stamps, forged signature, an address that belonged to a condo across town, its geometry was sharp and unmistakable. Marcus had filed for divorce, listed a different residence and, according to the coroner of facts that sits in legal paperwork, made choices Laya had not consented to. In the parking lot behind the courthouse, she watched a moving truck back into a unit on the 3rd floor of that other building. A woman whom she would later learn was Jenna Burrows stood on the balcony, smoking and looking like any other tenant who hadn't expected to be watched. The sight of them together was almost trivial. 2 humans, a life being arranged. But its ordinariness made the betrayal deeper. It meant he hadn't left in a moment of fracture. He'd been building an alternative. She did not scream. There was a strange, quiet constriction in her throat, a small, private fury that didn't want to perform. She packed what she needed. Her badge from the hospital, a few framed photos, a stack of uniforms. She left the rest. She left the life that had been easy to take for granted, and she moved into a small rental 2 neighborhoods over. The walls were paper-thin, the heating a little too loud, the streetlights too bright, but the apartment was hers to sign for, to pay for, to claim. Money became a practical problem. Night shifts multiplied, until Laya moved through her schedule like someone stocking up for a winter she hadn't expected. Over time, felt like a lifeline. Emma, her sister, brought casseroles and an extra set of sheets. Their parents called every day, careful in tone. "Take care of yourself," her mother said, and Laya understood the phrase to mean more than any order to sleep. She learned to accept help without turning it into a crisis. She learned to cook for one without making a meal of nostalgia. The humiliation was not public. She kept the courthouse folder folded flat in a drawer, yet it pressed on her in private ways. She would wake at 3 in the morning with her hands tingling, the memory of the clerk's voice looping in her head. Sometimes she sat on the cheap balcony of her new apartment and watched delivery trucks and couples and thought about how much of life is faith. Faith in the other, faith in shared stories, faith that the person you married would not quietly move the lines. She didn't spend her nights spinning unproductively. There was a small, fierce resolve that took root. If someone could erase her as a partner without telling her, she could rebuild the parts of life that depended on her. Not for pride, not for revenge, for safety, for dignity. Months passed in a rhythm of shifts and small domestic victories. She made the lists that made grown-up lives possible: pay rent, refill prescriptions, fix the leaky sink. She opened an account in her name only. She kept track of paper trails. She saved in a way she had never been allowed to in the marriage she had assumed would secure them both. On a night that was both ordinary and tired, the moment that split the story happened like every other small, impulsive choice. She was running on 12-hour shifts, exhausted, and she stopped at a white gas station with a flickering marquee. Her eyes skimmed the counter. Gum, lottery tickets, energy drinks. A $5 scratch-off was an absurd purchase for a woman who had begun to price every indulgence. She thumbed the ticket from the clerk and stepped back into the cold. Her hands were still shaking from work. The ticket was thin and alive between her fingers. She scratched absent-mindedly at first, then more carefully, as if the numbers might be fragile. When she revealed the third row, the digits resolved like a sudden, bright diagram. $18 million. She didn't feel the usual dirty thrill of instant wealth. There was no joy at first, only the sharp flash of disbelief, and then an immediate practical fear. This money would change the dynamic around her, and not everyone who came near because of it would be honest. Marcus, who had rewritten their life without asking, might see this as an invitation. Others might see opportunity, exposure, exploitation. For a long 10 minutes she stood at the counter holding the ticket while the clerk said things that registered only as distant, legal murmurs. The fluorescent lights were harsh. The asphalt smelled like winter. Her hands felt absurdly human. Not the hands of a headline, but the hands of a nurse who had steadied strangers through panic. She had to make choices that would protect her and what she was responsible for. She did the sensible thing she had been practicing since the divorce discovery. She moved slowly. She didn't shout her win at the hospital or post it online. She did not show up at the condo with champagne. Instead, she called a lawyer, Evelyn, whose last name is indefinido in the record she had, on the recommendation of a friend from the hospital. Evelyn's voice was brisk and steady on the other end of the line. Laya told herself she would do everything to secure the windfall without fanfare. She would treat the win as a tool, not a vindication. Evelyn came with calm competence. She checked the ticket, verified the claim through the proper channels, and warned about the attention that could follow. She recommended that Laya avoid public announcements and take steps to keep the process discreet. Laya listened, grateful for practical instructions that didn't demand narrative or catharsis. Do the sensible things, protect what matters. She met with a financial advisor, a woman named Marisol, at a firm someone had recommended, who spoke in terms of security, paying debts, creating long-term plans, allocating funds for family and for charity. Laya didn't want to become a different person. She wanted to be a woman who could breathe without measuring every breath against a bill. She paid off the immediate debts that hung like anchors, savings to the parents, covering the hospital's HR snafus that had plagued Marcus's casual handling of joint accounts, clearing out liens that had shadowed small family businesses. She bought a modest house in a neighborhood she loved, not a mansion, but a place with a yard, thick walls and windows that looked out onto maple trees. The new home was unremarkable in the way that matters. It was a place she owned and signed without someone else's initial beside hers. The process was antiseptic and profoundly ordinary. There were meetings with bankers and soft-voiced transfer agents, but also the mundane moments, choosing paint that didn't unsettle her, planting a rosemary bush in a stubborn rectangle of dirt, unpacking kitchenware in a way that felt like reclaiming more than the physical objects. Money had given her options, but the choices she kept were the same ones anyone would make when deciding how to live. Safety, quiet joy, the capacity to help others. If the lottery was the sudden mechanism that opened the door, her measures were the hinge that kept it open. She did not become extravagant. She chose to stabilize first, to create a foundation that would prevent future manipulations. She made decisions in the light of that philosophy: discreet philanthropy, targeted gifts to those who had supported her, and a planned donation to a women's shelter that had once given a co-worker a bed during a crisis. She started small, quietly, slipping checks into envelopes and signing them "For the women who need a night." Meanwhile, Marcus unraveled in parallel, not as a dramatic cinematic downfall, but in the predictable knock of consequences. His small business began losing clients, contracts dissolved. The same person who used secrecy as a tactic met the slow collapse wrought by exposure. Jenna left, whether because of what she discovered or because the facade could not hold. The records did not state explicitly. The breakup's reasons were indefinido in many private accounts, but the practical result was the same. Marcus became more visible, and visibility to him meant desperation. At first, his contact was intermittent and contained in voicemail, a strained, familiar cadence asking how she was, tentative apologies that avoided the word forgery, a question about whether they could talk. Laya listened to one message and then deleted it. She allowed another message to exist in the phone for a day before she replayed it and felt the old chord of grief tighten. The calls escalated from recorded tones to direct texts. "We need to talk," one read. "I made mistakes," another said, a sentence with no detail and no context. When he finally showed up at her new door, it was a Tuesday with the late light of winter. Laya opened the door because, in a way she had not admitted to herself, she wanted to see the face that had made her life a ledger. Marcus stood there, with a coat he could have worn either out of habit or to signify company. His eyes were red, but that was not necessarily remorse. Sometimes red eyes come from the stress of losing everything, from debt collectors calling, from people you once leaned on stepping away. He spoke quickly, in phrases that patched together pleading and explanation. He asked whether they could meet, said he missed her, said he regretted what had happened. He did not admit the forgery. He did not explain the signature that had been typed and filed. He spoke in guilt-laced practicalities. Could they reconcile finances? Could they? He asked this oddly, as if the question would open a door she'd kept closed. Laya listened. She had rehearsed nothing. She had only the shape of what she had learned. Trust, once dissolved, could not be reconstituted by words alone. She had learned to separate need from love, the difference that the DNA of a relationship sometimes obscures. Marcus wanted a life with stability, and he wanted the woman who had once provided it. But wanting solace from someone you harmed is not the same as asking for forgiveness and making restitution. She did not slam the door. She did not fling open her chest to sorrow. She offered him the dignity of presence and the boundary of action. She told him slowly that there would be no reconciliation built on the bones of what had been done. She explained, without theatrics, that she had legal counsel and had taken actions to protect herself. She did not lecture. She stated facts like a nurse giving a prognosis, plain, necessary. Marcus left that evening with the shape of a man who had been refused a certain kind of easy access. The legal intervention that sealed the emotional boundary came in the form of a letter delivered by counsel. Evelyn, last name indefinido, had the authority to make plain what boundaries looked like when backed by counsel. The letter was not theatrical. It indicated that contact of certain kinds would not be tolerated and that further attempts to intrude would trigger legal responses. The letter named the core concern, the forged signature, the manipulation of records, without spilling every private wound into public text. It established space. It served as an instrument that turned Laya's quiet resolve into enforceable limit. Marcus tried again, undercut by need. He left messages that were less shameful and more frantic. He asked whether she could help him with contracts or introductions. He implied, clumsily, that they could rebuild the practical life they had lost. Jenna's absence was a kind of punctuation in his messages, an absence that explained a great deal without giving reasons. Laya's answer remained the same. She would not be the bridge between his past and his future. She would not take on the responsibility of his undoing. By then, Laya's life was fuller in modest ways she had not expected. The house had a single maple tree in front that shed its dry leaves in autumn. She drank coffee on the back stoop and felt the sun warm her shoulders in small increments. She planted a rosemary bush, tended to it like one tends to an intention. She took short trips with friends. 2 nights at a shore town where the salt air erased the static in her head, a quiet flight to visit a distant cousin who ran a bakery. Travel did not mean celebration. It meant being allowed to be curious again. Her giving was deliberate. She volunteered a monthly stipend to the women's shelter she had once visited as a volunteer orientation. She funded a small job training program for women in the shelter that taught basic bookkeeping and computer skills. The money allowed the shelter to expand a tiny way, more beds, a counselor for 3 afternoons a week. She did not plaster her name across the effort. She slipped checks into envelopes and used a foundation set up under her advisor's guidance. She wanted support to be about the people who needed it, not the woman who provided it. There were small, private moments of revenge in the sense of satisfaction when she watched Marcus stumble in the margins. A notice on a small business door, a name removed from a vendor list she once helped manage. But she did not gloat. Her satisfaction was quieter, like the soft certainty that comes after you lock a door and know it will stay closed. Marcus's calls eventually tapered. His attempts to reinsert himself into her life dwindled in tone and frequency. When he reached out with pleas that he was trying to fix things, she had a repository of documents, counsel, and above all, a decision. She would not reopen what had been deliberately broken. One day, months after the first scratch, she met some of the women from the shelter she supported at a community fair. They moved through the crowd with the kind of joy neither cheap nor manufactured. A woman in a faded coat hugged Laya and thanked her for the job training that had gotten her a part-time position at a bakery. Another had enrolled at a night class and was learning to type. Laya listened, and the gratitude that touched her was not about money. It was about being part of a small net that caught people before they fell too far. The money had extended her capacity. The meaning she drew from it came from the lives that really changed because of it. If there was a moral to the story, it was not that the lottery was justice. The ticket had been a sudden opening, nothing more. Justice for Laya had been built out of small, intentional actions, hiring counsel, solidifying accounts, paying what needed paying, choosing a home she could call wholly hers, and using some of the funds to aid those who had no safety net. The money made options possible. The choices she made with it made life sustainable. There were quieter consequences, too. Friends she had assumed would be neutral sorted themselves in ways that were instructive. Some offered warmth and steady companionship. Others drifted when proximity to wealth complicated the equation. Laya received a few awkward calls from people who began to calculate whether they could ask for loans or favors. She learned to answer with plainness. "I'm not an ATM," she thought once, smiling at her bluntness, and then she called Evelyn to ask about the best way to manage small requests, though no one had to become the villain in her life. Boundaries are not meant to punish, they are meant to preserve. Marcus's last attempt to reconcile took a shape predictably human. He arrived at a small cafe where Laya often worked a shift between hospital rotations. He sat across from her in a weathered chair and said, "I need your help." The phrase was almost banal. It did not include admission of the forged signature, nor a clear expression of remorse for having built a life outside of their shared vows. He wanted counsel. He wanted shelter. He wanted the person he had used as a foundation to play the role of restoration. Laya's response was steady. She offered him resources that did not involve intimacy, referrals to professional services, the name of a counselor, the address of job postings. She did not meet his eyes more than necessary. She had learned that mercy did not require open doors. The final seal on that chapter arrived when Jenna made one of those ordinary human choices that revealed more than either of them wanted to articulate. Jenna moved somewhere else. Whether she left because she discovered details or because living in a life constructed on half-truths had become impossible, records call it nothing more than a change of address. For Laya, Jenna's departure removed a particular source of tension. It was not a triumph, but it was a relief. Marcus's business continued to falter quietly. He watched from a distance as his options narrowed. He called less. He left messages fewer and softer. The page turned, even if not deliberately. Laya's days glowed with smaller, richer details. She planted succulents on the sill of her kitchen window and found herself drawn to routines that affirmed stability. A morning walk, a kettle that sang, a stack of books that invited her back into curiosity. She resumed training sessions at the hospital, mentoring a young nurse who reminded her of the fierce fatigue and joy that comes with the work. These were the pages of life she chose to fill. Her giving became more public in measured ways. She appeared once at the shelter's annual fundraiser, not as a wealthy patron seeking attention, but as a quiet witness to how funds had been used. She told the room, simply, that shelters need predictable support, and that opportunity can look like a small job training class that leads to a steady paycheck. Her remarks were short. The focus, intentionally, was on the people the shelter served. The final time Marcus came to her door, it was not in a storm of pleading, but in a small, prosaic knock that matched the smaller, more humbled tone of a man who had lost leverage. He asked whether they could at least amicably finalize matters that remained unsettled, paperwork, accounts, trivialities. He had learned finally the vocabulary of settlement. Laya replied that she had legal counsel and that they would communicate through appropriate channels. She did not reopen old wounds. She had learned that peace is not the same as forgetting. It is the quiet company of self-possession. The closing months of the story were not cinematic fireworks, but a steady, honest domesticity. She took a trip with Emma to a place by the ocean, where the waves moved like a metronome, for conversation. She donated quietly to a scholarship for nurse training. She fixed the fence at the house herself one afternoon, hands prickled with splinters, thinking with the amusement of someone who owns both the house and the labor that keeps it together. On a late afternoon, with the rosemary fragrant and a small kettle steaming beside her, Laya sat on the back steps and watched a neighbor's child chase a pigeon's shadow across the lawn. She thought about how many different kinds of protection exist: legal counsel, bank accounts, the physical solidity of walls, the quieter kind that comes when you plant your feet and choose daily what to defend and what to let go. She thought of the clerk's voice in the courthouse, how official languages can cause sudden collapse, and of the scratch-off ticket that had been equal parts shock and instrument. She had everything she needed, not because she had humiliated an ex-husband or because fate rewarded her virtue. She had needed to claim her life back, to take care of herself, and to build in ways that would not allow someone else to decide the shape of her days. The lottery had been the unexpected key. The work had been what turned it into a door she could walk through. There remained no reconciliation. Marcus had returned because he had lost the arrangements that had supported him. He had not returned because of a new humility that could heal what had been broken. Laya recognized the difference and made a choice that kept the dignity of everyone involved. She would not be dragged into the narrative of someone else's survival. She traveled sometimes, nothing ostentatious, but trips that made her feel present. She donated quietly and with intention. She spent afternoons reading again, and she learned finally to sleep without checking the phone at night. Her house filled with quiet objects she liked, a worn armchair, a lamp that gave off soft light, potted plants that thrived with her sparse attention. The sounds of her life were ordinary and steady, the hum of the fridge, the distant laugh of a neighbor, the turn of a page. When the camera of memory pans back, the story is clean of sensationalism. A woman was betrayed. She moved into survival. She won an unlikely sum. She used it to secure what she valued: safety, autonomy, and the chance to help others. The antagonist, the man who filed papers without her consent, returned briefly, but not with the moral authority to reclaim anything he had erased. He came back in need. She met him with boundaries. In the end, she had what mattered: a home that belonged to her, the knowledge that she could manage resources to protect herself and to offer help where it was needed, and a life arranged around her values instead of someone else's secret decisions. Standing on her back steps, she touched the rosemary, inhaled the green, resinous scent, and felt a kind of quiet vindication in the most unromantic of ways, the steady breathing of a life reclaimed. If this story reached you with the same steadiness it had taken to live it, and you want to hear more true life turnarounds like Laya's, hit subscribe and stay with us for more. If this account moved you, consider supporting local women's shelters. Small donations and volunteer hours do real practical work in people's lives. Link in description. Like many stories that begin with loss, this one did not end with spectacle. It ended with agency. It ended with giving back. Laya did not gloat. She simply lived. She had everything she needed: safety, purpose, and a quiet home where the plants thrived and the light stayed on. And when she looked at herself in the evening mirror, she recognized not the woman defined by a forged signature, but someone who had been erased and then reclaimed her life, step by steady step. Like and subscribe for more true life turnarounds. If this story moved you, consider supporting local women's shelters. Link in description.